I grew up believing that family was supposed to protect you, to stand beside you in every storm. My parents taught me that my brother, Daniel, was my shield, my companion, my confidant. He was 3 years older, louder, and always full of charm. People adored him. Teachers praised him. Neighbors admired him. And even at family gatherings, the spotlight somehow always found its way to him. I didn't mind. I was the quiet one, the one who blended into the background. I believed my time would come one day, but I never imagined that the very person who was supposed to protect me would one day betray me in the cruelest way possible. When my parents passed away within the same year, my world shattered. Losing them was like having the ground pulled from beneath my feet. I remember sitting at the funeral, numb, staring at their photographs surrounded by flowers, and feeling as though life had suddenly become foreign, like I was living in someone else's story. And through all that grief, Daniel was there, standing tall, making promises. "Don't worry, Lily," he told me, his hand squeezing mine. "I'll take care of everything. I'll take care of you." I wanted to believe him. He was my brother. He was all I had left. A few weeks after the funerals, the lawyer contacted us. My parents hadn't left behind vast wealth, but they had worked hard their entire lives. A family home, some savings, investments. They had built a life that was meant to secure our futures. And in their will, they had split everything equally between Daniel and me. 50-50, equal. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, the smell of polished wood, and old books heavy in the air. The lawyer explained everything carefully, sliding documents across the desk. My parents had trusted us to share everything, to honor their wishes. I felt a small flicker of comfort then. Even in death, they had thought of fairness. But Daniel's expression that day haunts me still. At first, he looked calm, almost bored, as though all of this was just routine. Then, slowly, I noticed the corners of his lips tighten, his jaw clench. He didn't say anything outright, but something changed in his eyes. It was as if he had just realized something he couldn't let go of, that I had a claim to half of everything he thought belonged only to him. At the time, I brushed it off. Grief does strange things, I told myself. Maybe I was imagining it. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on with life. I stayed in the family home, taking comfort in the walls that had witnessed my childhood. Daniel, however, grew distant. Calls became rare, his visits even rarer. And when he did come, he seemed restless, always pacing, always checking his phone, always talking about plans that I wasn't included in. Then came the shock. One morning, I received a notice in the mail. It was a legal document, stamped and official, stating that the family house, my parents' house, had been sold. My heart raced as I read the words again and again, unable to process them. How could it have been sold? I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't agreed to anything. Panic consumed me. I called Daniel immediately. He answered casually, as though nothing was wrong. "Daniel, what is this?" I cried. "The house. It's been sold." "How?" There was a pause. Then his voice came, calm, cold. "Relax, Lily. It's done. I handled it. The house was just sitting there. I found a buyer, and it's better this way. We needed to move forward." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Better this way? That was my home, Daniel. Our parents' home. You had no right. He cut me off sharply. I had every right. I'm the eldest. I know what's best. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I remember standing there in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, my hands trembling so hard I almost dropped it. Betrayal doesn't come like a sudden thunderclap. It comes like a slow poison, seeping into your veins until you can't breathe. That was the moment it hit me. My own brother had stolen from me. He had taken what was mine, what my parents had intended for me, and decided that his wants mattered more than my rights. I wanted to fight, but I was unprepared. I didn't understand the legal documents. I didn't know what steps to take, and Daniel knew that. He counted on it. He knew I was drowning in grief and too naive to protect myself. Over the following months, I discovered that it wasn't just the house, the savings, the investments. He had drained accounts, shifted papers, manipulated signatures. By the time I realized the full extent of what he had done, it was too late. Everything my parents had left behind for us was gone. At first, I begged him. I remember sitting across from him at a cafe, tears streaming down my face, pleading with him to undo what he had done. "Please, Daniel," I whispered. "This isn't what Mom and Dad wanted. They wanted us to share. They wanted us to have each other." He just leaned back in his chair, sipped his coffee, and smirked. "Grow up, Lily. The world isn't fair. You were always the weak one, the quiet one. I did what I had to do. You'll survive." That smirk lit a fire inside me that I didn't know existed. For weeks I couldn't sleep. Anger consumed me, twisting my grief into something darker. Every memory of my parents, every lesson they had taught me about trust and loyalty, clashed with the image of Daniel's cold, smirking face. I realized something then. Begging him, pleading with him, it would never work. He saw me as weak, as someone he could walk over forever, and maybe I had been weak. Maybe I had been too trusting. But that version of me died the moment I realized my brother had stolen my future. That night, I made a vow. I would not rest until I took back everything he had stolen from me. And when I did, I would make sure Daniel regretted underestimating me for the rest of his life. After the day, I swore to myself that I would take everything back. My life changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. At first, it felt like an impossible mountain to climb. I was broke, angry, and broken-hearted. But beneath the pain, a new strength was building, one I didn't recognize at first. The betrayal had burned away my old self, the version of Lily who had been soft, timid, and willing to trust without question. In her place was someone sharper, tougher, and more dangerous, someone who was no longer afraid to fight. I started with knowledge. Daniel had used legal loopholes and financial manipulation to strip me of what was rightfully mine. If I wanted revenge, I couldn't just scream and cry. I needed to outsmart him at his own game. So I buried myself in research. By day, I worked a small job at a bookstore, just to keep the lights on. By night, I sat at my kitchen table with stacks of library books and my laptop, learning everything I could about law, inheritance rights, and financial systems. I joined online forums where people shared stories of betrayal and legal battles. I even reached out to an old friend of my father's, Mr. Harris, a retired lawyer who began mentoring me quietly. "You're sharper than you think, Lily," he told me one evening as we sat in his dusty office. Files piled high around us. "Your brother made one mistake. He underestimated you. That's where your power lies." Those words echoed in my mind every night. For the first time since my parents' death, I began to feel hope. While I learned, I also started saving. Every paycheck from the bookstore, every spare coin, I tucked away. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I refused to depend on anyone else again. Meanwhile, Daniel was living large. His social media painted the picture. Flashy cars, weekend getaways, expensive suits, and dinners at high-end restaurants. He looked untouchable, and maybe to the outside world he was. But to me, every picture, every post was evidence. Evidence of how reckless he had become. The arrogance that had driven him to steal from me was now pushing him to flaunt it. And arrogance always leaves cracks. One night, scrolling through his photos, I noticed something strange. In the background of one of his celebratory dinner posts, I spotted a man I recognized, a local businessman with a reputation for shady deals. My instincts screamed at me. Daniel wasn't just spending recklessly, he was getting involved with the wrong people. That was when my plans started to take shape. I didn't just want to get back what was mine. I wanted Daniel to collapse under the weight of his own greed. I wanted to strip him bare, the way he had stripped me. And I knew exactly how I would do it. I would use his own arrogance, his own choices, to destroy him from within. But first, I needed to rebuild myself. Months turned into a year. I worked harder than I ever had in my life. I climbed the ranks at the bookstore, eventually managing the place. My boss, impressed by my dedication, offered to sponsor me for courses in business management. I took them eagerly, knowing that every piece of knowledge was another weapon in my arsenal. At night, I studied law under Mr. Harris's guidance. He pushed me, tested me, and refused to let me quit, even when exhaustion threatened to drag me under. And slowly, I began to change. My voice grew stronger, my confidence sharper. People around me noticed. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. But Daniel still thought of me as the weak little sister he had crushed. He never checked on me, never wondered how I was surviving. To him, I was irrelevant, forgotten. That was his biggest mistake. The turning point came one afternoon when I stumbled across a file that Mr. Harris helped me dig up. It was a record of the house sale, the very deal that had robbed me of my home. And tucked away in the details was something Daniel had overlooked. A forged signature, mine. My hands trembled as I held the paper. He hadn't just manipulated the process. He had forged my signature to complete the sale. That was fraud. Illegal. Suddenly the pieces clicked. "Do you know what this means?" Mr. Harris asked, his eyes gleaming. "Yes," I whispered. "It means he didn't just steal from me. He committed a crime." From that moment, my path was clear. But I wasn't reckless. I knew I couldn't just storm into court and demand justice. Daniel had resources, connections, and the ability to twist narratives. If I rushed in unprepared, I'd lose. So instead, I gathered evidence, witnesses, records, anything that painted the picture of his betrayal. I kept it all hidden, tucked away where he'd never find it. At the same time, I started building my own name. I invested the little savings I had into a side hustle, an online book business. It grew slowly at first, but soon it began to take off. Orders increased, profits trickled in, and for the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was building. All the while, I watched Daniel spiral further into greed. He invested in risky ventures, partnered with questionable businessmen, and flaunted wealth he didn't actually have. His empire was built on sand, and I was ready to be the wave that washed it away. Then came the night that sealed my determination forever. I ran into Daniel at a party hosted by a mutual family friend. It had been years since we'd spoken face to face. He looked polished, successful, every inch the man he pretended to be. "Lily," he said with a smirk, swirling a glass of champagne. "Didn't think I'd see you here. How's life in obscurity?" The old me would have flinched, maybe even cried, but not anymore. I met his gaze, steady and unshaken, and smiled. "Better than you think, Daniel. Much better." For a flicker of a second, I saw something in his eyes, hesitation, uncertainty. But then it vanished, replaced by arrogance. He chuckled and turned away, dismissing me as though I didn't matter. And that was fine, because soon he would realize just how much I mattered. Soon, he would regret everything. By the time another year passed, I was no longer the fragile sister Daniel had dismissed. I had transformed into someone new, someone he would no longer recognize. My online business had flourished into a steady income stream, and I'd begun networking with people in publishing and commerce. I wasn't rich yet, but I was self-reliant, confident, and most importantly, patient. Patience is a weapon most people underestimate. Daniel was the opposite of patient. He wanted instant results, instant gratification, instant power. and that's why he was vulnerable. Through contacts I had carefully built, I learned more about his business ventures. He had started a company with one of those shady businessmen I'd spotted in his photos, a man named Victor Cruz. Victor was infamous in local circles for conning investors, starting fraudulent projects, and disappearing with the money. My brother thought he was clever by partnering with him, but I knew Daniel was being played just as much as he had played me. That gave me my idea. I began feeding Daniel opportunities, but indirectly. Through mutual connections, I let whispers of lucrative deals float into his circle. Deals that looked promising, but were designed to crumble. I never attached my name to them, of course. I simply planted seeds, and his greed did the rest. One of these deals involved a piece of land supposedly primed for development. On paper, it looked incredible. Prime location, cheap price, endless potential. In reality, it was tied up in legal disputes that would drag on for decades. Daniel jumped at it without hesitation, pouring money into the project. Another was a so-called tech startup that promised groundbreaking software. The founders were scam artists who had fooled bigger fish than Daniel. He invested heavily, boasting about it at parties, only to discover months later that the founders had vanished. Each time he stumbled, I was there in the background, invisible, watching his confidence crack bit by bit. He didn't know I was the ghost in his shadow, tightening the noose one thread at a time. But I wasn't satisfied with watching him lose money. I wanted him to lose face, reputation, and pride. So I began to infiltrate his social circle. Quietly, of course. I made connections with people he trusted, bankers, business associates, even his personal assistant. It wasn't difficult. People gravitate towards sincerity, and I had mastered the art of listening. While Daniel boasted and bragged, I listened. And in listening, I learned everything. One night, over drinks with one of his associates, I learned that Daniel had used forged documents more than once, not just with the house, but in several financial deals. Fraud wasn't an accident, it was his pattern. And every pattern eventually leads to exposure. That was the moment I realized my revenge wouldn't just be personal. It would be legal. It would be absolute. I began compiling a secret dossier. Every shady deal, every fraudulent signature, every manipulated contract. I collected it all. Mr. Harris guided me on how to present it in court, how to protect myself legally, and how to ensure the evidence was airtight. Still, I kept waiting, because timing was everything. Then fate handed me the perfect opportunity. Daniel announced that he was hosting a massive gala to celebrate the success of his company with Victor. It was to be his crowning moment, the night he would show the world how powerful he had become. Politicians, investors, celebrities, they were all invited. And somehow, through one of my new connections, I secured an invitation too. The night of the gala, I stood before the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at me. Gone was the timid girl who had once begged her brother for fairness. In her place was a woman in a sleek black dress, eyes sharp with purpose. Tonight wasn't just about blending in. Tonight, I was stepping into the spotlight. When I arrived, the room was a glittering display of wealth and ego. Daniel basked in the attention, shaking hands, laughing loudly, clinking glasses. Victor stood beside him like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When Daniel spotted me, his smile faltered for just a moment. Then he recovered, striding over with mock surprise. "Well, well," he said smoothly, kissing my cheek. "Didn't expect to see you here. Upgraded from bookstores to galas, have you?" I smiled, unbothered. "I go where I'm invited, Daniel." He smirked, clearly amused at my presence, and turned back to his guests. To him, I was still irrelevant, a ghost at his feast, but that night, I had no intention of being invisible. As the speeches began, Daniel took the stage, boasting about his vision and success. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the room. He looked untouchable again. The golden boy, the charming leader. But I knew the truth. And soon, so would everyone else. When the applause died down, I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the marble floor. The room quieted as people turned to see who dared interrupt. Daniel's smile froze when he saw me approach the stage. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady, carrying across the hall. "My name is Lily, and before you celebrate my brother's so-called success, I think you should all know the truth." A murmur swept through the crowd. Danielle's face drained of color. I pulled out a folder from my bag, the dossier I had built piece by piece. "This man," I said, pointing at him, "forged documents to steal from his own sister. He has committed fraud in multiple deals, used illegal signatures, and partnered with criminals to finance his lies. I have the evidence right here." Gasps filled the room. Cameras whirred. Daniel lunged toward me, hissing, "What are you doing?" I didn't flinch. Telling the truth. Security intervened as reporters swarmed, demanding answers. Victor slipped away like the snake he was, leaving Daniel alone under the spotlight. The same spotlight he had always craved was now burning him alive. That night, Daniel's empire began to collapse. Investors pulled out, scandals hit the papers, and authorities opened investigations. But I wasn't finished. That was just the public humiliation. The real reckoning was still to come, because I wasn't going to stop until I had taken back everything. And by the time I was done, Daniel would wish he had never underestimated his little sister. The weeks after the gala were a blur of headlines, subpoenas, and whispers. Daniel had always loved the limelight, but the same cameras that had once adored him were now relentless in their scrutiny. Reporters dissected his past deals. Investors demanded audits, and law enforcement dug where they had previously looked the other way. I watched from the sidelines as the delicate house of cards he'd built started to tremble and then shudder. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. Beautiful because justice, long overdue, was finally unfolding. Terrible because every victory came with a price I hadn't fully counted on. At first, it felt like vindication. Daniel was suspended from the boards he sat on. Contracts were frozen, and his partners distanced themselves in public statements that reeked of guilt. His once glittering social feeds went quiet, then defensive, then accusatory. He tried to fight back with lawyers, with PR, with rage. He called me names, accusing me of grandstanding, of fabricating evidence. He threatened me in late-night texts that were equal parts desperation and bravado. "You'll regret this," he wrote. Then, hours later, "Come home, we can fix this." I knew better than to answer. The man who wanted to fix things at the kitchen table, after stealing my life away, had never intended to fix anything honest. He intended to control, to manipulate, to dominate. That same control had ruined our family. It would not be allowed to stand. The investigations rolled on. Authorities unearthed more forged documents, suspicious transfers, and a pattern of financial abuse that implicated Daniel in ways I had only suspected. Each discovery felt like a small victory, but it also meant reopening wounds. My parents' name dragged into court filings, their legacy dissected under the harsh glare of legal analysis. I had to remind myself often why I'd started this. Not for drama or revenge alone, but to restore what they had intended for me, and to make sure no one else in our family would fall prey to his cruelty. As Daniel's public life collapsed, his private life began to fray in ways that weren't publicized. I learned quietly, through the contacts I had cultivated, that he was sleeping little, drinking too much, and lashing out at anyone who tried to help. His girlfriend left him. A childhood friend who had once covered for him in business meetings stopped answering his calls. Pride, which had always been his shield, became his chain. Watching him fail was one thing. Watching him unravel was another. There was a bitter satisfaction in seeing him face consequences, but also a sober recognition that punishment had human costs. The man who hurt me was still my brother. That truth didn't make my mission any less righteous, but it complicated what I felt at night when the house was quiet and memories crowded in. Meanwhile, the legal fights I had ignited were grueling. Daniel's lawyers were aggressive. They tried to discredit me, to paint my motives as jealousy, to call my evidence forged or planted. They filed countersuits, alleging defamation and extortion. For every step forward, 1,000 bureaucratic obstacles reared their heads. I spent endless hours in meetings with Mr. Harris, going over depositions, crafting witness statements, and preparing for hearings. The stress was relentless. There were days I felt I couldn't breathe, that the courtroom's sterile light would swallow me whole. Yet I kept going. I had tasted what justice looked like, and I refused to back down. The costs weren't only emotional. My savings, what I'd carefully built from my small business, were being consumed by legal fees, travel, and the price of subpoenaed documents. Friends offered help, and I accepted when it felt right. But pride forced me to shoulder much of it alone. I wanted the victory to be mine, untainted by charity or pity. Financial strain taught me new lessons about resilience and humility. I accepted second jobs, worked late shifts, and learned to find rest in 10-minute naps stolen between court dates. The life I had been building became a balancing act, and every moment I wasn't working felt like a risk. There were nights when the rage that had fueled me softened into exhaustion and doubt. What had started as righteous fury sometimes turned into a cold, hollow drive that kept me awake until dawn. I wondered whether the cost of revenge would ultimately hollow me out. Would I become the kind of person I despised, consumed by bitterness and willing to sacrifice everything for retribution? To avoid that, I held on to small anchors. A letter from my mother found in a drawer, a childhood photograph, Mr. Harris's steady voice telling me, "You're doing the right thing." Those fragments kept me human when the process threatened to turn me into a legal automaton. Then came the day the prosecution announced charges. The court filings were extensive, multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The judge set dates for hearings, and suddenly everything felt painfully real. I sat in the gallery the day the indictment was read, my hands folded in my lap. Daniel stood across the room, gaunt, hollow-eyed, but defiantly unbowed. Our eyes met, and for a fraction of a second, something like regret flickered across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by anger. He mouthed words I couldn't make out. Perhaps they were threats, perhaps apologies. I didn't allow myself to listen. The trial dragged on. Witnesses testified. Bank records were revealed. Experts explained forensics of signatures and the way documents could be traced. The courtroom was a theater of truths and half-truths. Daniel's defense tried to paint him as a desperate son who had made mistakes while trying to uphold the family's financial legacy. But the evidence was strong. Forged signatures, transfers that traced back to his accounts, a paper trail of lies. The jury watched, and slowly perception shifted. Outside the courtroom, however, life continued in strange ways. Social media became a battleground. Some people crucified me as a traitor to family for exposing Daniel. Others cheered my courage. My inbox flooded with messages from strangers, victims of similar betrayals, survivors who had been waiting for someone to speak up. Their stories were both heartbreaking and galvanizing. I learned I was not alone. There were hundreds of people whose lives had been damaged by relatives who betrayed them for money and power. That knowledge steeled me. What started as personal revenge was morphing into something broader, a stand against a system where those with charisma and bravado could weaponize family loyalty to commit crimes. But victory in court wasn't the only thing I wanted. I wanted restitution. I wanted the assets returned, the accounts reversed, the house restored if possible. I worked with forensic accountants, tracing transactions, finding where the money had gone. It was messy and slow. Some funds were gone, laundered through multiple shells. Others were tied up in assets that could be seized. Piecing it all together felt like a scavenger hunt through a life that had been stolen from me. Then, in a private hearing, the prosecutor offered a plea deal, reduced charges for cooperation and partial restitution. It was tempting. It would close the case quicker, might guarantee some recovery, and spare me months of trial. But Mr. Harris and I discussed the implications at length. Accepting the deal might mean some accountability, but it would also allow Daniel to escape the full consequences of his actions. I pictured him walking away with his reputation slightly tarnished, but largely intact, able to rebuild from the ashes. The thought made my stomach turn. I declined. That decision meant more trial days, more stress, more money spent. It also meant a higher chance that Daniel would be fully exposed and punished. It was a gamble, but one I was willing to take. I had already sacrificed too much to let him off easy. Justice, I believed, required seeing the truth through to the end. The final days before the verdict were the hardest. I barely slept. I rehearsed statements in my head. I reviewed evidence until my eyes blurred. Friends asked if I regretted the path I had chosen. If I missed the girl who once believed family always protected you. The answer was complicated. I missed the safety of that belief, but I didn't miss being powerless. When the jury finally filed back in, the courtroom felt like a held breath. Daniel sat rigid, hands clenched on his knees. I sat with Mr. Harris, my palms damp. The foreperson stood and read the verdict. Guilty on multiple counts. The sound of the word hit me like a physical blow, and a healing salve all at once. The gavel fell in a rhythm that sounded like closure. Daniel's face crumpled, and for the first time since my parents' funerals, something inside me loosened. But the victory was not pure. Months later, Daniel was sentenced to prison time. Fines were levied, and restitution orders were placed. Some assets were recovered, others were gone forever. The house, by a complex legal path, became tied up in claims and counterclaims for years. The process of reclaiming it dragged on like a stubborn storm cloud. I realized then that revenge and justice are not tidy things. They're messy, slow, and rarely restore what was lost. Still, as I walked out of the courthouse that day, sunlight on my face, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. I had taken back what I could, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a part of myself. The cost had been high, friends lost, money spent, nights of restless doubt. But in the end, the scale had tipped. Daniel would pay for what he had done, and I had proven that being underestimated can be the most powerful weapon of all. The weeks after the gala were chaos for Daniel. His name, once uttered with admiration, now appeared in headlines dripping with scandal. Fraud, forgery, criminal investigation. Overnight, his empire had crumbled into ash. Investors abandoned him, partners distanced themselves, and even his so-called friends refused to answer his calls. But for me, it was only the beginning. I filed a formal lawsuit with the dossier I had built. Mr. Harris, ever loyal to my father's memory, helped me present the case with precision. The forged signature that Daniel had used to claim the house was undeniable. With every page of evidence, the court saw him for what he truly was. A thief, a liar, a manipulator. Daniel tried every trick. Delays, counterclaims, sob stories. He even had the audacity to approach me outside the courthouse one day. His arrogance stripped away. "You don't have to do this, Lily," he pleaded, his voice desperate. "We're family. We can work this out privately." I looked at him, my own brother, and for a fleeting second, I remembered the little boy who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street. But that boy was long gone. In his place stood a man who had stolen not just money, but years of peace, stability, and trust. "You stole from family, Daniel," I said coldly. "Now you'll face family in court." The trial was grueling. But I had one thing Daniel never possessed: truth. Witnesses came forward. Associates testified, and the mountain of evidence grew. Slowly but surely, the scales tipped in my favor. And then came the day the judge ruled. "The property and assets obtained through fraudulent means are hereby returned to the rightful owner, Lily Thompson." It was done. The house, the inheritance, everything my father had meant for me, I had taken it all back. The victory wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. For the first time in years, I felt my father's presence, proud and unyielding. But the court's decision carried more than just restitution. Daniel faced criminal charges for forgery and fraud. His sentence, 5 years in prison. When the verdict was read, I watched him lower his head in defeat. For once, there were no smirks, no mocking words, no arrogance, just silence. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the house. It felt strange walking through those doors again, the same doors I had been pushed out of. But this time, I wasn't broken. I wasn't begging. I was the rightful owner, standing tall. I renovated it, not into the shrine of luxury Daniel had wanted, but into something warm, something meaningful. The library was restored, filled again with books, including my father's journals. In the garden, I planted roses, my mother's favorite. The house became a home again, not a symbol of greed, but of resilience. And I didn't stop there. With the compensation I received from Daniel's frozen accounts and the growth of my own business, I built a foundation in my father's name, a charity that helped young women pursue education and entrepreneurship. My pain had forged purpose, and I wasn't going to waste it. As for Daniel, prison humbled him in ways I never could. He wrote to me once, a letter filled with apologies, excuses, and regret. I read it, but I didn't reply. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't for him. It was for me, and I had already forgiven myself for ever thinking I was powerless. Standing in the library one evening, I closed my eyes and imagined my father beside me. I could almost hear his voice. "I knew you'd find your strength, Lily. I knew you'd take back what was yours." He had been right. My brother took my inheritance. But in the end, I took back more than just money or property. I took back my dignity, my voice, my life, and that was worth more than any fortune.